Well, ahead of our elections next year, there are many questions here and in other countries about the role that digital and social media will play. How often have you seen political statements and comments on WhatsApp and, of course, on Twitter or on Facebook? There have been some fears around the world that, in fact, social media and artificial intelligence could play a role in who wins elections. But there's also evidence that many people do not trust social media and ignore statements on social media about politics. The Deputy Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Alvin, is in Addis Ababa taking part in a workshop on the use of digital and social media in elections on our continent. Deputy Minister, good evening to you and thank you for your time. Is there any certainty yet on which principles or guidelines are going to be adopted by the African Union on this?
Yes, no, thank you very much, Stephen. As we are speaking, there is a validation workshop that are taking place that seeks to clarify the framework and guidelines in relation to, in particular, social media and digital technology. Why it is a key imperative, Stephen, is that you may have read the report from the African Peer Review Mechanism, the APRM, earlier this year, which cited the adverse effect that the integrity of the elections processes may have, for example, not only on the elections, but also on unconstitutional changes of government. So I think we are trying to look at what is currently taking place on the African continent and obviously trying to prepare better for the more than 20 elections that will be taking place, including South Africa's one in 2024.
As you say, many people say social media is a very dangerous thing in elections. It's not mediated. It's difficult to regulate. WhatsApp groups are encrypted. How will these guidelines work?
Well, Stephen, we were fortunate to have a number of multinational social media companies present with us today in others. I think what we are looking at is enforcement in relation to the rules of Electoral Code of Conduct. Our ambition are that different electoral commissions will encapsulate this guidelines and framework within their specific Electoral Code of Conduct. So it will put a additional burden and responsibility on public representatives, on political parties, and on candidates in the upcoming electoral processes. For example, Stephen, you may know that the key issues that we are faced with when confronted with social media as a negative aspect is the consequence of, for example, malinformation, which are the truth that are repurposed for deceptive purposes. And that creates heightened anxiety during an electoral process amongst the electorate. So I think we are trying to mitigate those adverse effects of social media.
If a country ignores them, if a government on our continent uses social media to spread hate speech as part of a political campaign, for example, is there much the African Union can really do about it? It's very difficult.
Well, yes, I think, look, the African Union obviously is the apex continental body. It provides this framework, but once this framework has been domesticated by the Electoral Commission, it then becomes part of the regulations and statutes, which the different electoral courts will then reference when they rule on electoral misconduct, for example. And that includes, obviously, holding different governments accountable, including your political parties.
Deputy Minister, we've already seen, for example, there's an interesting case study in Zimbabwe where SADC believes the elections were not free and fair. Zimbabwe could be a test case of the impact of regional bodies in southern Africa. We've seen ECOWAS intervene in coups, for example. The Zimbabwe situation is very different. Do you expect SADC to act on the elections in Zimbabwe?
Well, Stephen, look, in the first instance, your body of authority is obviously your Independent Electoral Commission. That is your body of authority. And then the final arbiter on any elections disputes is then the judiciary. In South Africa, for example, you have your electoral court, and I think there is a mirror image of a similar judicial structure in Zimbabwe. What the SADC Observer Mission normally will look at, Stephen, is recommendations in relation to how to bring the electoral outcomes closer to the AU's Charter on Deepening Democracy. So there would obviously be some weaknesses that may be identified, but there will be a concomitant recommendations on how to then improve future elections processes. That normally is what your regional mechanism or your regional economic communities, such as SADC, are obligated to do.
So SADC says there were problems with the election. Does our government believe the elections in Zimbabwe were free and fair?
Well, our government, the South African government, are guided by what has been expressed by the Independent Electoral Commission, and it was for that reason that President Ramaphosa and Minister Pandor attended the inauguration, that once there's an unqualified expression from the IEC, Stephen, as a country that have proximity with Zimbabwe, we are then obligated to respect the outcomes of the Zimbabwean electoral processes as announced by the Independent Electoral Commission.
Where does that leave the SADC Observer Mission then and its findings?
The SADC Observer Mission will look at how to strengthen the overall electoral architecture of the Zimbabwean people. So it looks at recommendations, Stephen. For example, if you look at the fact that there has been issues raised on delimitation of boundaries and words, there's been issues raised around the type of funds, monies that candidates must pay before they can be registered as candidates in the Zimbabwean electoral process. So the SADC Observer Mission look at what it calls some elementary pitfalls that may have been experienced, and obviously it then constructs some recommendations so that we build obviously stronger electoral systems within the SADC region.
I'm sorry to concentrate on this, Deputy Minister, but it would seem almost as if there was really no point. I mean, you will know how many people in Zimbabwe feel the election was stolen from them. The opposition believes that the courts are not free and fair, that the courts are in fact captured, I think was the phrase they used, by ZANU-PF. I realize that we can't interfere, it's very difficult to interfere in the sovereign affairs of another country. But otherwise, I mean, really, if SADC says that the elections were not free and fair, and SADC doesn't act on them, and we're part of SADC, I have to ask you, I'm afraid quite pointedly, what's the point of belonging to SADC?
Well, Stephen, you were quite correct earlier on, because actually that is one of the Bandung principles that we subscribe to as a member of the non-aligned movement, is to respect the integrity, of member states of the non-aligned movement, including the type of democratic architecture that has been constructed. I think we would obviously, our conduct would be frowned upon if we question the integrity, firstly, of the Independent Electoral Commission of Zimbabwe, but secondly, Stephen, at no stage can the South African government nor any member state of SADC cast aspersions on the independence of the judiciary, not only in Zimbabwe but on the African continent. And it's obviously rather unfortunate when there was a decision made by the Zimbabwean opposition parties not to submit their grievance to the final arbiter on electoral disputes, which is the judiciary. And that obviously is the constitutional status that we look at when we speak about how do we look at from what is the optics through which President Ramaphosa look at how the Zimbabwean elections have unfolded.
Deputy Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Alvin, thank you for your time tonight.